Hello learners, welcome to the 27th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced the writer T.S. Eliot and began discussing a very influential essay by Eliot titled Tradition and the Individual Talent. I was talking about how Eliot provides a radical and powerful theory of newness and how the relationship between an individual writer and the history of literature that has been produced before this writer is actually very important and very unique. The radical suggestion from Eliot is that there's something about the newness of the individual poet's writing which allows us to go back and change how newness is appreciated in older writing as well. To better understand this, I will continue reading from Eliot's words. Eliot writes, "The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities." So it's a strange passage. On one hand, Eliot has explained that the poet has a duty to read a lot, to internalize the history of literature that was written before. On the other hand, Eliot has also said that merely replicating the historical styles of writing will not make for good poetry. In fact, the duty of the poet is even greater. First, read all that has been written, internalize the history of literature, and then produce writing which alters that history, alters the criteria on which the historical body of writing was considered powerful and great. So in a way, we can see that Eliot is increasing the burden on the poet. How much more can the poet do in order to succeed, in order to be considered a truly innovative and new kind of poet? So Eliot argues that just as the present is directed by the past, that is, new writers are guided by how older writers have described certain things, similarly, the past is altered by the present. By writing poetry, poets change the history of poetry. Right? This is how Eliot is having it both ways. On one hand, making a very conservative statement that in order to write good poetry, one has to read old poetry. On the other hand, saving himself or making this conservative idea quite radical by saying that merely repeating old poetry is not enough. One must change what that old poetry was. Further, Eliot writes that some writers can absorb knowledge, right? And here again, there is a great deal of intellectual work which Eliot continually incorporates as part of writing poetry. This, as we will see, was very self-centered and self-serving. Eliot was creating the ground for a favorable reception of his own poetry. Eliot himself, who was extremely erudite, he was very well-read, very intelligent, had multiple degrees from Harvard, was studying philosophy, was studying to earn a doctorate in philosophy, and had read a great deal of poetry in multiple European languages, was trying to find a way to make all of that erudition contribute to his development as a poet. So this is one way in which Eliot was doing that. he created a theory in which erudition and encyclopedic knowledge of the past, all of literature of Europe, was necessary preparation for creative work. So, intellectual work is a necessary preparation for creative work. Right? This is what Eliot is saying here. And Eliot also gives readers a way of appreciating the history of English literature from this perspective. Eliot writes, Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. Right? So, what does this mean? It means that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. So, what does Eliot want from the poet? Not to read a lot of books, sure, read some books, but ultimately to be able to extract from books, from history, the essence of a historical consciousness. So it is not, and this example of Shakespeare clarifies it, it is not that a poet must read every poem written in the history of their language or their country. But no, the poet must find a way of reading so that by reading one book from the past, the poet is able to get a sense of the historical consciousness of that period. So Shakespeare reads one book, that is Plutarch's history, and from that history is able to enter the consciousness of ancient Rome and write plays like Antony and Cleopatra or Julius Caesar. This is the example. Shakespeare's ability to create Roman history by reading one book is compared to that of a layperson who spends days roaming around the British Museum. Right? And what is this? It is not simply erudition. Erudition is not enough. Reading books, accumulating knowledge about the past, even if it is knowledge of cultural history, is not enough. Erudition can enable poetry only if it is accompanied by what Eliot calls a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. And so, Eliot's theory of poetry or theory of the growth of the artist is a theory of self-sacrifice, an extinction of personality. And again, here Eliot turns to the second major point that he's making in this essay, and that point is that of the theory of personality and the theory of the self, which had been very influential and which was accepted to be a dominant theory of poetic creation in England at that time. It was most powerfully provided by the poets of the Romantic era, most powerfully writers like William Wordsworth with the egotistical sublime, who had defined poetry as the expression, as the refinement of emotions. Emotions emerge from a place inside the poet's person. Right? As a human being, we experience a lot of emotions. Poetry was defined earlier as the articulation, refinement, and expression of emotions which are experienced by the poet as a person. This theory of poetry is something that Eliot was challenging very powerfully. Against this theory of the expression of personality, Eliot argues that the poet must not express their personality, but rather make their personality extinct. And here is how Eliot expresses himself. My meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and expressions combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. So the two things, the personality and the poetry, are decoupled. Eliot says some emotions may be experienced as powerful in one's life. There is no guarantee. In fact, there is no assumption that because these feelings are powerful in personal life, they will be powerful in the poetry that one writes. And the reverse is also true. The most insignificant feelings, or feelings which were insignificant to the person, to the experience of the poet as a person, may come to be the most powerful feelings that animate the poetry that the person writes. And further, Eliot goes on to completely reject Wordsworth's definition of poetry, that poetry is made by emotion recollected in tranquility. For Eliot, this is an inexact formula. Eliot writes, "It is neither emotion nor recollection, nor, without distortion of meaning, tranquility. It is a concentration, a new thing resulting from concentration of a very great number of experiences, which to the practical and active person would not seem to be experiences at all. It is a concentration which does not happen consciously or of deliberation. These experiences are not recollected and finally unite in an atmosphere which is tranquil, only in that it is a passive attending upon the event." So what is happening here? This is a very important passage. Eliot completely rejects one theory of creation of poetry, and in the place of that theory, substitutes and supplants his own theory of poetry. The theory of poetry which is rejected describes that emotions are experienced and then they are recollected in tranquility. The poet is in a restful, inspired state, and almost in a passive way, the poet waits for inspiration. And when inspired, the poet is able to recall their own experiences, their own emotions, and when they recall them, they are able to write them down as poetry. And this is how poetry is made. For Eliot, this is nonsense. This is not how poetry is made. In order for poetry to be made, the poet requires to make a deliberate effort. They cannot wait for inspiration. They cannot sit in a tranquil state and recall their emotions. Rather, they make an effort. They undertake labor. They undertake labor and they exert themselves. They concentrate very powerfully, not just on their emotions, but on the history and the technical aspects of the form that they have chosen to practice. That is the form of poetry. And the key difference between these two is the difference between native English poets, that is, poets who were born and therefore inherited the literary and cultural capital of English literature. That is one kind of poet. For a poet who inherited that cultural capital of English literature, tranquility, recollection, the expression of emotions would naturally lead to the creation of poetry. Since Eliot was an immigrant and could not count on his own inheritance did not allow him that access to English literary culture. His own inheritance was that of the Mississippi River, St. Louis, Missouri, education at Harvard, a great deal of literary history. How could these things lay the foundation and enable Eliot to compete with poets who had inherited the literary culture of London? The theory of concentration, the theory of deliberate act of intellectual labor, which would lead to the creation of poetry. So this is what Eliot achieved. Eliot gave a theory of poetry which was very close to his status as an immigrant, which linked language and literature very closely without using the words to one's race, to one's ethnicity. Further, Eliot writes, there is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. And this leads Eliot to correct what he finds to be a major misunderstanding, a major misconception in the idea of what is personal. Eliot writes, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Very deep and powerful words and a contradictory message from a young man. Eliot here was trying to create a theory of poetry which would foreground his own conditions. His own conditions were that of a writer who had a great deal of knowledge, who was quite skilled with the language, but who did not inherit the social networks or the cultural capital of the literary culture in London in the early 20th century. And so the only option available to T.S. Eliot was to create a new literary culture. Since he was an outsider, he could not inherit that literary culture. He set himself the task, the ambitious but doable task of building a new literary culture, a new theory of poetry which would give as much importance to one's education, to one's intellectual labor, to the task of concentration, to deliberate efforts, discipline, a professional outlook on creative labor, as much as to things like inspiration, emotions, personality, etc. Eliot created a theory of poetry which had less to do with the freedom to choose and the freedom to inherit, and more to do with the choice of labor. Writing poetry was not something that happened naturally. It was not the overflow of emotions. It was a choice, a deliberate choice, a choice to exert oneself intellectually as well as emotionally. So all of this theory of escaping personality, why does Eliot lay so much emphasis on escaping personality? It is because Eliot wanted to give up his own personality and assume a new personality. The personality of the American poet from St. Louis, Missouri, that was what Eliot wanted to escape. And the identity of a poet established in London, reading, writing, publishing, creating networks of patronage, mentorship, and rivalry. This was the identity that Eliot wanted to assume. And so this explains the emphasis on impersonality, on escaping personality, and the emphasis on motion. Eliot was a traveler. He was an outsider who wanted to become an insider. And that fact makes Eliot appreciate the value of emotion and personality, while also emphasizing that it is not about where one comes from, but rather what one does with it, where one is trying to go, that makes the writing truly poetic. Now, in the remainder of this lecture, I will discuss another prose piece that T.S. Eliot published, again in the same period. This essay by Eliot is titled The Metaphysical Poets, and it appeared in the pages of the Times Literary Supplement in October 1921. This was a review of a recently published book, that is, uh, the- a book titled Metaphysical Lyrics and the Poems of the 17th Century, Donne to Butler, selected and edited with an essay by Herbert J.C. Grierson. Now, in this essay, Eliot lays down a very controversial, very interesting, and very, very compelling historical idea. The idea is presented without much evidence, without much proof, but the idea is such, and it is articulated with such impeccable fluency of the English language, that it proved to be quite persuasive. In fact, many people assumed and took Eliot's claim to be true, even though it is very clear that it is a claim that is based more on Eliot's own opinion and his own inclination and his desire to establish a way of thinking than it is based on any historical proof. So, what is that claim? The claim is, and in Eliot's words, it is something which had happened to the mind of England between the time of Donne or Lord Herbert of Cherbury and the time of Tennyson and Browning. It is the difference between the intellectual poet and the reflective poet. Tennyson and Browning are poets and they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. A thought to Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility. This is the idea. It is a very, very powerful historical idea. It's an idea of how change has occurred in England. And if one thinks about it, one must notice the remarkable ambition, if not arrogance, and the presumptuousness of this claim. How can one poet claim to have understood something that changed in the mind of England? England is a country, and how people think in England, in the cultural and intellectual culture of this nation, a remarkable change has occurred. And Eliot is making a claim about all of England. And this is a change that has occurred over 200 years. The time of Donne and Lord Herbert, and the time of Tennyson and Browning. That is, from the 17th century to the 19th century. Tennyson and Browning are poets whom Eliot's readers remember as being alive and writing in their own lifetimes. There is a great deal of difference between these two poets and these two sets of poets, and that difference is key for understanding both what metaphysical writing is, as well as for understanding the culture of England in which Eliot found himself. And what is that difference? Eliot writes that it is the difference between the intellectual poet and the reflective poet. And it is very clear that the reflective poet is superior, whereas the intellectual poet is inferior. And an example of that is that for John Donne, who is the prime example of a metaphysical poet, a thought was an experience. A thought was not an academic or intellectual activity. Whereas for poets like Tennyson and Browning, thinking is a very mechanical and academic activity. They fail to describe their thought as immediately as a physical or bodily experience, a physiological experience, like that of the odor of a rose. Attentive readers will notice that there is a common thread in both of these essays. The thread is that of a poet and a scholar trying to find a new way to make intellectual labor appear and sound and feel creative enough. Again, here, the thought of Donne, the intellectual nature of Donne's poetry and writing, is presented as an organic, wholesome, bodily, and creative task. right? Whereas the emotional quality of the writings of Tennyson and Browning, they are dismissed. They are presented as something too academic, right? Whereas in fact, one could argue that the reverse is true, that that the writing of Tennyson and Browning is much more connected to the bodily experiences, to the emotions that human beings feel, and that the writing of Donne is too academic, too cerebral. But in fact, this was the counterintuitive nature of Eliot's essay, and the power of Eliot's fluency and the quality of the language that Eliot used, that an idea that appeared so contradictory and so counterintuitive could be presented as if it were the universal truth. I will read one more passage before concluding this discussion. Eliot writes, "When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating disparate experience. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The latter falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other, or with the noise of the typewriter or the smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes." To conclude this lecture, I will ask you to notice, pay attention to how Eliot has slipped from describing a historical difference between the quality of the writing of two sets of poets, that is, the reflective poet and the intellectual poet, and how Donne was a reflective poet and Tennyson and Browning were intellectual poets. That no longer is being done. And here, Eliot has slipped into describing the qualities of the ideal poet. And the most important quality of the ideal poet is that the poet retains the ability to amalgamate, to synthesize disparate experiences into new wholes, right? And here again, the goal or the thesis is to justify one particular kind of writing, the kind of writing that Eliot and his contemporaries would do, and to disparage or dismiss forms of writing that were quite popular in the late 19th and early 20th century poetry. Rhymed verse, such as that written by Tennyson, is being disparaged here because it appears too formal and too mechanical. Whereas one could just as easily argue that the kind of writing that Eliot and Pound practiced with their esoteric references were also quite academic. And so to counter that charge, Eliot's argument here is that a true poet or a truly powerful and interesting poet is one who can treat both intellectual experiences as well as bodily experiences as the same thing. Both are equally capable of generating powerful words in the poems that were published on the page. We will continue our discussion of T.S. Eliot's prose and how that shapes his poetry, and go on to discuss the magnum opus, which is 4 quartets, in the next lecture. Thank you.